Okay, everyone, we can start very soon. So I would like to thank Lucienne Spencer for agreeing to do this presentation today as part of our philosophy and psychiatry seminar. We had a bit of a trouble with our main camera in the grand hall, so I'm calling from my own laptop, but hopefully everything will else be okay. So Lucienne is just a little introduction. Wellcome Trust-funded postdoctoral researcher at the Institute of Mental Health, University of Birmingham. And her research interests include phenomenology, epistemic injustice, philosophy of psychiatry, of course. She is also a member of the executive committee for the Society for Women in Philosophy UK. And I know Lucienne from the Renewing Phenomenological Psychopathology project that she is part of right now at the University of Birmingham, which is very exciting and interesting. And today she will be talking about the epistemic harms of empathy, which seems like a bit of a controversial theme for me. In phenomenological psychopathology, something that seems very counterintuitive, but we will hear her arguments today. So thank you, Lucienne, again for being willing to present today. And hopefully we'll have an interesting discussion after this. You will have around 45, 50 minutes to talk. So the floor is yours, please.
Great. Thank you so much for such a lovely introduction. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. And can you see the screen? Everything's working all right, my end? I can't hear you, Yanko, but I'm seeing nods from Ellie, so
Yeah, the screen is there.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So yeah, hello everybody. It's my pleasure to be speaking at the Philosophy and Psychiatry seminar. After receiving the invite, I've watched all the videos in your back catalogue, and I'm honored to be amongst those fantastic speakers. So as Yanko said, my name's Lucienne Spencer. I'm a postdoc for the Renewing Phenomenological Psychopathology project at the University of Birmingham in the UK. The paper I'm going to be presenting today is an article that I co-wrote with Professor Matthew Broome as an output of this project. So I'm going to briefly plug the project before I begin, in case people might be interested in participating in it. So the Renewing Phenomenological Psychopathology project is an international exchange award funded by the Wellcome Trust, and it's co-led by Professor Matthew Broome and Professor Giovanni Stangolini. And in the search for alternative approaches to psychiatry, there's been this reignited interest in phenomenological psychopathology in recent years, which I'm sure you guys are aware is an approach that uses the phenomenological method to highlight the lived experience of the person with mental ill health and invites a person-centered approach to diagnosis and treatment. And as promising as phenomenological psychopathology might be when it comes to liberating our understanding of psychiatric illness, it's important that the tradition doesn't fall prey to the same pitfalls encountered by alternative psychiatric approaches, as phenomenological psychopathology hasn't really done much to adapt from its roots in the philosophy and social science of the early to mid 20th century. It risks falling back into siloed thinking and in turn falling into obscurity and irrelevance. The full founder of phenomenological psychopathology, Carl Jaspers, defended the need for revolutionary approaches to psychiatry, and yet not that much has been done to try and imbue phenomenological psychopathology with contemporary viewpoints and methodologies and the perspectives of people from marginalized backgrounds. So that's where we come in, where we try to renew, revitalize the field, and the paper that I'm going to present stems from that research, as in one way that we've been trying to do that. I've put the email address at the bottom there, and maybe I can put into the chat at the end a link to our website and a link to joining our mailing list in case people are interested in what we're up to and want to take part in some of our schemes. So here's the paper that I'm going to be presenting today that, as I said, I co-wrote with Professor Matthew Broome, the title of which is The Epistemic Harms of Empathy in Phenomenological Psychopathology, and we published this in the journal Phenomenology and the Cognitive Sciences. So Jaspers identifies empathic understanding as being an essential tool for grasping not the mere psychic content of the condition at hand, but the patient's lived experience. And this method then serves as the basis of phenomenological psychopathology. And in recent years, scholars in the field have attempted to refine the concept of empathic understanding for its use in contemporary clinical encounters. Most notably, we've got Stangalini's contribution of second-order empathy, and we've got Ratcliffe's radical empathy. And through this talk, I'm going to reject the pursuit of these renewed versions of empathic understanding on the grounds that this aspect of the methodology is prone to error and is fundamentally ethically flawed. So I think we should just throw it out altogether. So here's my agenda. I'll begin by examining Jaspers' account of empathic understanding and its significance within the wider context of phenomenological psychopathology. I'll then highlight renewed versions of empathic understanding put forward by Matthew Ratcliffe and Giovanni Stangalini. I'll conclude that it's impossible to adopt Jaspers' concept of empathic understanding without inheriting the epistemically unjust attitudes that accompany it. I'll argue that empathic understanding risks error, which might lead to misdiagnosis or mistreatment or an overall misunderstanding of the condition at hand. And two, I'm going to propose a unique form of epistemic harm that Matthew Broome and I call epistemic co-opting. Okay, so empathy. Philosophers have been captivated by this concept of empathy since the term's relatively recent introduction into our vocabulary via the German Einfühlung in 1873. And it's a term that continues to defy easy definition. And its characterization seems to depend on the intention of the user. Driven by the theory of mind debate, scholars have attempted to theorize empathy in order to address questions of how and to what extent we can come to understand others. And contenders for theories of empathy include simulation theory, theory, and the argument from analogy. Many of the significant contributors to the richer concepts of empathy belong to the field of phenomenology, and that includes the likes of Sheila and Stein and Husserl. These phenomenological accounts grapple with the interpersonal dimensions of empathy, and empathy as an intentional experience, and empathy as a means of experiencing the other. Since its introduction to psychiatry by Theodore Lipps, empathy has played a significant role in mental health discourse. Although Lipps evoked the term empathy to identify our capacity for understanding other people at a primordial level, in public mental health literature, the term has been appropriated, for want of a better word, as a corrective tool for bad ethical practices in psychiatric care. In these contexts, empathy takes the form of a compassionate attempt to relate to the experience of the person with a mental health condition. Through such empathy, the healthcare professional is perceived to cultivate virtuous interpersonal practices of fostering trust, demonstrating respect, and adopting a sympathetic attitude. Although some proponents of these arguably shallow accounts of empathy recognize that practicing empathy improves our understanding of a given condition, its primary function is to enhance the doctor-patient relationship in clinical encounters. And while some scholars have challenged these accounts of empathy, like Gardner and Stefanello, the dominant view is that empathy is necessarily good for clinical practice. My goal isn't to weigh in on those competing accounts of empathy in philosophy or to challenge the care-based accounts of empathy that are popular in public healthcare. Rather, I'm specifically targeting Jaspers' empathic understanding in contemporary approaches to phenomenological psychopathology. And I hope to show that there's a serious need for us to reevaluate that concept on epistemic and ethical grounds. So yeah, I want to make that really clear before I begin, because I've had some comments back to me that are kind of defending these care-based ideas of empathy, and I think those things are very important. I'm looking specifically at Jaspers' empathic understanding, and I think that's the thing that's problematic. And seeing as it plays such a key role in phenomenological psychopathology, I think it's about time that we take a look at it and think about whether we really do need it and what it does. Okay, so confuses the phenomenological tradition of early Husserl with the psychology of his contemporaries like Wilhelm Dilthey and Max Weber and George Simmel to form a revolutionary approach to psychiatric practice known as phenomenological psychopathology. In the article that he wrote in 1912, which was called The Phenomenological Approach in Psychopathology, an article that kind of acts as a blueprint for his magnum opus, General Psychopathology. In that article, Jaspers begins by distinguishing between the objective and the subjective symptoms that one can examine in the psychiatric patient. So objective symptoms can be observed on the surface and deduced through sense perception and rational thought. And objective symptoms include concrete events that can be perceived by the senses, like physical gestures and speech expression. Two, all measurable performances, whether the patient has the capacity to work or learn or retain memory. And three, the rational content of what the patient tells us, reports of delusion. These objective symptoms were the main focus of the psychotherapists in Jaspers' day and arguably still dominates modern psychiatry. In contrast, Jaspers identifies that the psychiatric patient also has subjective symptoms that are not so easily assessed. Inspired by Husserl, Jaspers understands subjective symptoms to be the elusive inner life of the psychiatric patient. For Husserl, the object of phenomenology is the pure description of how phenomena appears to consciousness. In the words of Liberty, he says, phenomenology was seen as a movement away from Cartesian dualism of reality being something out there or completely separate from the individual. And instead of that, Husserl posits that the subject and the world are actually irrevocably intertwined. While the Cartesian view, according to Husserl, presented consciousness as being empty of content, a phenomenological approach reveals this rich content of consciousness. This can be understood as the emotional, temporal, spatial, intentional style of one's embodied experience of the world. Through Husserl, Jaspers claimed, I found confirmed what was already at work in me, the urge to the things themselves. In a world full of prejudices, schematisms, conventions, this at the time was like a liberation, Jaspers says. Then finding Husserl, Jaspers enthusiastically puts aside the traditional methods and the narrow frameworks of psychopathology to reconstruct it anew. Rather than objective phenomena, Jaspers sought to excavate the subjective phenomena of the patient's psychiatric condition. In other words, their lived world experience. So how do we actually access the subjective phenomena for Jaspers? Unlike objective symptoms, subjective symptoms, according to Jaspers, can't be perceived by the sense organs, but have to be grasped by transferring oneself into the other individual's psyche. And Jaspers calls this empathic understanding. Okay, so before we role of empathy, I want to briefly reflect on understanding in psychiatric healthcare. So the medical encounter begins with an important question. In what way are you feeling unwell? In somatic medicine, this question triggers the start of a diagnostic process that involves the combination of the patient's testimony and a direct physical examination of the physical malady. However, in psychiatric healthcare, this question has a unique quality. This question is the start of an excavation into the internal and ineffable mental life of the psychiatric patient. While Jaspers suggests that aspects of this psychiatric life are readily available through objective symptoms, the life world of the patient isn't so easily accessible. For this reason, understanding, perception of meaning, or Verstehen, as Jaspers puts it, plays a central role in his work. He recognizes that psychiatric healthcare is essentially a hermeneutical endeavor, an exercise in understanding and meaning making. So there's no straightforward universal translation for any psychiatric experience. Rather, the healthcare professional must consider this vast interpretations that the patient might call upon and act as what Jaspers calls the investigator of meaning. For instance, an experience of hallucination may present itself as terrifying and uncanny for one person. It might elicit a bodily reaction like cowering or stimulate particular beliefs like I'm in danger, and will induce particular feelings connected with this meaning like despair. Alternatively, a hallucination may be experienced as a positive spiritual event, eliciting entirely different bodily responses, beliefs, and feelings. It may not be interpreted as an illness at all, for example. As such, phenomenological psychopathology isn't just about identifying and supporting the treatment of a psychiatric illness. It's about trying to expose the unique meaning structures of that psychiatric condition for the patient. The result of empathic understanding is more than a mere description of what it is like to have a certain psychiatric condition. It's an attempt to gain an in-depth knowledge of the interpersonal, intentional, temporal, spatial, and affective structure of the patient's life well. So Jaspers is careful to draw a clear distinction between empathy and sympathy. He recognizes that sympathy is valuable as a virtue in clinical practice because, as he says, completely dispassionate observation misses the essence of things. However, while it is a kind of catalyst for understanding, sympathy isn't a means of understanding in itself for Jaspers. Its predominant role in psychiatry is kind of to gratify the patient rather than to actually understand them. The goal of empathy in psychiatry, on the other hand, is to gain an essential, personal, indefinable, and direct understanding. This empathetic understanding is not easily accomplished. Jaspers acknowledges that it requires both practice and the ability to perform an act that very closely resembles the Husserlian phenomenological reduction or bracketing. Before empathic understanding can occur, the clinician must pursue an isolation of phenomena, a suspension of all outmoded theories, psychological constructs, or materialist mythologies of cerebral processes and basic constructs or frames of reference. This bracketing then seems to include the bracketing of taxonomy, of classification of that are pre-established in psychiatry, as well as bracketing inherited, obsolete psychological theories that might influence the psychiatrist. More generally, Jaspers calls for a suspension of how we assume psychic events to be through an unprejudiced grasp of the subjective phenomena in his words. Once this freedom from preconception, as he calls it, has been achieved, the clinician can access the lived experience of the patient through empathic understanding. Jaspers observes three ways in which you can exercise empathic understanding. First, through the immersion in the gestures, behavior, and expressive movements of the patient. Second, through an exploration of the patient's experience through structured interview. And third, through written self-descriptions from the patient. And while Jaspers acknowledges that this third one, self-description, is the hardest of the three to perform, he thinks that it's the most valuable phenomenological method when it's successful. And that's because self-description provides an unclouded, reliable account of a lived experience and doesn't risk falling prey to the prejudice that might imbue a psychiatrist's questioning, like in interview. Okay, so trying to understand whether empathic understanding is meant to be direct or indirect can be a bit tricky because Jaspers seems to oscillate between empathic understanding being direct to it being indirect through his writings. On the one hand, he describes empathic understanding as transferring oneself into the other, so the psychiatrist can directly access the patient's life world. As such, through a unique form of perception, empathy, as Jaspers says, always leads directly into the psychic connection itself. Jaspers also refers to empathic understanding as transferring oneself into the other, into their individual psyche. On the other hand, Jaspers also claims that those psychic experiences and phenomena which patients describe to us only become accessible to us secondhand. He also states direct accessible psychic experiences are like foam on the sea's surface. The depths are inaccessible and can only be explored in an indirect and theoretical way. So which one is it? Is it meant to be direct? Is it meant to be indirect? I think to understand whether empathic understanding is direct or indirect for Jaspers is worth looking at Searle, who, as I've already made clear, very much inspired Jaspers. So Husserl advocated for empathy as being a quasi-direct experience of the other, the intentionality in one's own ego that leads into the foreign ego, as Husserl puts it. And to be clear, Husserl doesn't suggest that it's possible to genuinely constitute the other person in the manner that they constitute themselves. That would result in a complete breakdown of even the concept of there being an I and the other. Rather, we embrace the other into our subjectivity in the same way that we embrace other aspects of the world, which is through intentionality. So, for instance, the pen is part of my bodily possibility to write. This tea is part of my bodily possibility to drink, and so on. And similarly, we embrace the other as a possibility for interaction. Much like Jaspers, Husserl compares empathy to a form of perception. When I see the other smile, I directly perceive that expression of joy, and there's no inference necessary. And that's not to say that I don't see that expression in the same way that I perceive joy firsthand. In the words of Gallagher and Zahavi, the expression is saturated with the meaning of the mind. It reveals the mind to us, and in this sense we experience the emotion as directly as we can without first-person access. So to Jaspers, empathic understanding allows for the immediate grasp of expressive phenomena. And in this sense, we can interpret Jaspers' empathic understanding as being quasi-direct, thus retaining a distinction between the I and the other. And that would explain Jaspers' paradoxical description of empathic understanding being simultaneously direct and indirect as well. So I think what he's trying to get at is this kind of quasi-direct access. Once empathic understanding has been mastered, Jaspers posits that the clinician obtains an inner representation of the patient's experiences. He says, it's possible to partake in the inner life of another person through a tentative exchange of roles, a certain dramatic play, which nevertheless is no play but real. In so doing, the patient and the psychiatrist co-inhabit the same life world, which equals the Mieterleben. For Jaspers, this understanding is a form of perception, as the psychiatrist doesn't merely think along with the patient, but sees along with them. And Jaspers says this process is not only one of simple observation, like reading of a measurement, the exercise of a self-involving vision in which the psyche itself is glimpsed. So it's important to note that for Jaspers, empathic understanding does have its limitations. In general psychopathology, Jaspers contrasts that which is meaningful and allows empathy with the ununderstandable. And falling into the latter category, that of the ununderstandable for Jaspers, are primary delusions of schizophrenia. So what is it about the nature of primary delusions that defies empathic approaches to understanding? For Jaspers, there's something about the uncanny nature of those experiences that prevents the psychiatrist from being able to relive it. Jaspers questions, as he puts it, how far can our understanding go in such cases when we cannot base it on any conscious experiences of a similar kind? In addition, such experiences don't lend themselves to expression through interview or self-description. Due to the ineffable nature of the condition, psychosis often defies language. However, Jaspers doesn't suggest that the subjective symptoms of the person with primary delusions can't be understood at all. For the ununderstandable, Jaspers suggests we turn to explanation or erklären, as he believes that primary delusions can only be understood through naturalistic, causal explanation rather than understanding them as meaningfully motivated by various circumstances. So Jaspers' discussion on the ununderstandable got me thinking about this link between empathy and intersubjectivity. If empathy breaks down in a case of radically altered lived experience, then it seems that empathic understanding needs to be grounded on some kind of shared experience of the world between the clinician and the patient. And that's reminiscent of Merleau-Ponty's account of intersubjectivity. There's lots of accounts of intersubjectivity that this is in line with. I just happen to be a big Merleau-Ponty fan, so I'm going with this one. Merleau-Ponty argues that we have an intersubjective relationship with the other, as we recognize that we engage in a shared world with them. And Merleau-Ponty has this example that I like, where he's observing this man who is being impacted by the world in the same way that Merleau-Ponty is. It's a really hot day in Paris, and they're both out in the sun. And Merleau-Ponty notices this man, and he sees that the sun is burning him, that the sun is making his eyes squint, making him sweat, it's making him pick up his hat and fan himself with it, which is exactly the same actions that Merleau-Ponty is doing, it's performing. So Merleau-Ponty identifies in the other's gestures that they are experiencing the same bite of the world. That's Merleau-Ponty's phrase. He says, we both have the same bite of the world. We're experiencing the bite of the world. And in contrast for Jaspers, I feel like those that, it seems that he's saying that those that are experiencing a radically different bite of the world can't be understood in this way. So I feel like there's something essential behind empathic understanding that requires this kind of intersubjectivity to occur for Jaspers. Okay, so now I'm going to look at some modern revisions of Jaspers' empathic understanding. As I've said, Jaspers argues that those with radically different experiences are immune to empathic understanding. The ununderstandable, people who have primary delusions and schizophrenia. In Jaspers' words, he describes those people as having a transformation in their very awareness of reality. And indeed, there's a history of delusional experiences and schizophrenia more broadly being singled out as profoundly different lived experiences. Contemporary phenomenological accounts of schizophrenia agree that those with the condition experience a dramatically altered lived experience. You've got the work of like Kruger and Parnasse, and my friend Rosa Riccianano has done some great work on this as well. And it's been observed that this makes schizophrenia particularly difficult to understand for the person who hasn't experienced it. And while schizophrenia can be grasped through alternative methods, for Jaspers, empathic understanding isn't up for the task of interpreting such a radically different lived experience. Now, this inclusion of the ununderstandable has provoked contemporary phenomenological psychopathologists to try to revise Jaspers' account of empathic understanding so that we can understand these schizophrenic experiences. Ratcliffe, Sass, and Stanglini have argued that schizophrenia can be understood through an alternative form of empathy. Ratcliffe calls it radical empathy, and Stanglini calls it second-order empathy. Both revisions of empathic understanding introduce an additional step to the procedure that allows one to, in the words of Sass, bridge the unbridgeable. What I'm going to show, though, is that I think this revised version of empathic understanding is very similar to Jaspers' empathic understanding. It does bring one new element to it, but I don't think that new element overcomes the epistemic harms that I'm going to identify later. So, Stanglini and Ratcliffe all advocate for empathic perception being being between direct and indirect perception of the other, a quasi-perception, as Ratcliffe puts it. And this quasi-perception seems to fit the Husserlian account I described previously of empathy, whereby one grasps the other's expression and experiences it quasi-directly, while still not as directly as first-person perception. And in so doing, Ratcliffe claims we can form an us experience, which I think sounds a lot like Jaspers' notion of Meterleben, this shared experience. On these grounds, one can empathically understand even the most radically different lived experience, according to Ratcliffe and Stagliani, through this kind of radical or second-order empathy. But as I've said before, I think that this is actually what Jaspers was trying to get at. I think that he did have in mind already this kind of quasi-direct form of empathic understanding in mind, since he goes between the direct and the indirect, and he was very much inspired by Husserl. So I don't think that this is necessarily bringing anything new to the table. In addition, Ratcliffe and Stagliani advocate for the use of the phenomenological reduction prior to empathy. So in order to understand the ununderstandable through radical empathy, Ratcliffe suggests a suspension of the natural attitude. Ratcliffe says, if we know or suspect that the other person has never seen buses before and has no grasp of the norms associated with them, we might, when engaging with their experience, bracket our more usual assumptions that these are features of a shared world. So too, Stagliani proposes achieving second-order empathy requires bracketing my own pre-reflective natural attitude, in which my first-order empathic capacities are rooted, and approaching the other's world as I would do while exploring an unknown country. But as I've said, this phenomenological reduction, this suspension of one's prejudices is already an essential feature of empathic understanding. Although he doesn't use the term phenomenological reduction, it mirrors it completely. We know that, again, that he was very inspired by Husserl. I think this is what he had in mind. So again, I don't think this is adding anything new either. Okay, here is the thing that I think is a key distinction between Jaspers' empathic understanding and this revised understanding of empathy that Ratcliffe and Stagliani contribute. And is that the latter call for an acknowledgement of the difference between the I and the other. Stagliani states, I must acknowledge the radical difference that separates me from the way of being in the world that characterizes the other. Ratcliffe says, he refers to this as adopting a distinctive kind of other-directed attitude. Adopting the other-directed attitude, according to Ratcliffe, is an intellectual, theoretical endeavor which allows for openness to the other. Only upon recognizing the profound difference of the other's life world can we have a kind of dynamic, quasi-perceptual exploration of another person's experience, or a phenomenological appreciation of their experience as it is for them. So I don't think this is what Jaspers was saying. So I do think that this is something new that they're contributing in terms of our empathic understanding, which I think is very interesting. And they seem to acknowledge the importance of recognizing that the other has a different lived experience to myself. And I think that's really important. So here's a quick recap of what second-order empathy and radical empathy is. While radical or second-order empathy is, I think, maybe on the surface a promising development of Jaspers' account, I'm going to ultimately argue that there are fundamental problems with empathic understanding, with Jaspers' empathic understanding. These evolved concepts don't overcome. And while we can indeed form some kind of intersubjective connection with the other, who has a radically different lived experience through kind of openness like that described by Ratcliffe, and that's in line with accounts of intersubjectivity by Husserl and Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty, I don't think that this necessarily entails understanding the other's experience, certainly not understanding it on the same level as us who's experienced it themselves. And more significantly, there's a high risk of being overly presumptuous of one's ability to understand the life world of the other through an empathic approach. Okay, so I'm now going to challenge empathic understanding. I think before I start doing that, at this juncture, I want to make it clear, and I want to observe that the psychiatric encounter, both the clinician and the patient bring essential knowledge to the table in order to understand and to treat the condition in question. The clinician contributes expertise in psychiatric methodology, causal processes, treatment methods, and so on. The clinical knowledge possessed by the healthcare professional shouldn't be discounted or trivialized. However, this clinical knowledge shouldn't be conflated with experiential knowledge. And to clarify, my interest here is in clinicians who don't have the requisite lived experience of the condition in question and attempt to obtain it through empathic understanding. That's when you would be using empathic understanding, of course. And obviously some clinicians have got the requisite lived experience. There might be a psychiatrist who has depression and they're supporting somebody with depression. That's completely separate. What Jaspers is using empathic understanding for is to try and understand something that they haven't experienced. Okay, so although Jaspers cautions against losing the sense of inexhaustibility and the enigma of each person with a psychiatric condition, he says we ought to keep in the face of the seemingly most trivial cases. Empathic understandably does just that. I argue that to overstate the level of insight the clinician can gain from any form of empathic understanding can lead to a misunderstanding and a misappropriation of the psychiatric condition. Stangolini claims by unfolding the structures of a patient's pathography, we can understand an author better than the author themselves. However, assuming that the clinician can know the lived experience of the other risks an inaccurate representation of the subject's phenomena and risks undermining the patient's epistemic privilege. Illness, for want of a better word, is an epistemically transformative experience. Due to a monumental shift in the person's embodied experience, they might be thrust into an unfamiliar life world with new and often inexpressible meaning structures. Such contexts give us experiences that we wouldn't otherwise have had, and that we cannot know what it is like to have until we undergo them, knowledge that cannot otherwise be acquired. In other words, certain experiences such as childbirth, you have to have the requisite bodily experience in order to know what it is to experience that. And the same thing could be said about psychiatric illness. So, for example, depression. According to Styron, he says the incomprehension of depression by others isn't driven by a lack of sympathy, but it's driven by a basic inability of a healthy person to imagine a form of torment so alien to everyday experience. This epistemically transformative experience makes empathic understanding impossible to perform for those without the requisite lived experience. And thus, in attempting to assume the first-person perspective of the patient, the clinician is likely to misrepresent the condition. Consequently, empathic understanding is highly vulnerable to error and hinders knowledge acquisition. Second, there's a danger that empathic understanding could facilitate a unique form of epistemic injustice. Epistemic injustice was first theorized by Fricker, Miranda Fricker, got a picture of her there, to, in her words, delineate a distinctive class of wrongs, namely those in which someone is disingenuously downgraded or disadvantaged in respect to their status as an epistemic subject. The epistemic nature of the injustice derives from a person being wronged in their capacity as a knower, as someone who can convey knowledge. The injustice of epistemic injustice lies in the marginalized person being degraded qua knower and symbolically degraded qua human. And this is because an essential aspect of their humanity, their epistemic agency, is challenged. It's also worth emphasizing that for Fricker, epistemic injustice is necessarily non-deliberative. And by this she means that epistemic injustice isn't some kind of calculated false representation of another person's epistemic agency. To me, that might be something more like gaslighting. Instead, epistemic injustice is far more implicit. When epistemic injustice occurs, the hearer is swayed by a deep-set identity prejudice that they're unaware that they even hold. Fricker says this absence of deliberate conscious manipulation makes epistemic injustice so difficult to spot and therefore even more important to name. Fricker identifies two key forms of epistemic injustice. There's hermeneutical injustice, where certain groups are excluded from contributing the hermeneutical framework, resulting in gaps in their knowledge, and then testimonial injustice, where testimony from marginalized groups are dismissed by virtue of an identity prejudice. So anyone who has read my previous work might think it's really weird that I'm starting to claim that there are aspects of phenomenological psychopathology that are epistemically unjust, because nearly all of my work has been advocating for phenomenological psychopathology as a means of epistemic justice, as have other philosophers like Ian James Kidd and Javi Corral and Rosa Ritonano. And I do still stand by those ideas wholeheartedly. And I think it is actually a great alternative to modern approaches to psychiatry, because rather than a one-size-fits-all approach, phenomenological psychopathology is striving to facilitate reflective awareness and communicability of the patient's first-person account through doctor-patient dialogue. And when they do that, it means that we're advocating for the epistemic agency of the person. We're able to achieve testimonial justice when we take seriously the first-person reports of the patient, which we often do in phenomenological psychopathology. And we can achieve hermeneutical justice when we reject, the interpretive frameworks that are normally advanced by diagnostic manuals like the DSM, and instead aim towards a language that originates from the patient's experience. That would be hermeneutical justice. However, as phenomenological psychopathology is upheld as being this benchmark for epistemically just approaches to psychiatry, I think it's even more important that we closely examine all of the methodology, especially those that are 100 years old, like empathic understanding. So in what follows, I'm going to argue that this antiquated aspect of the methodology, empathic understanding, inhibits epistemic agency of the patient and therefore needs to be replaced or thrown out altogether if epistemic justice is to be achieved properly. So the epistemic injustice that I identify here is a form of what Emmeline Davis, a picture of her there, has dubbed epistemic appropriation. And we call this subset, Matthew and I have named it epistemic co-opting. So in a case of epistemic appropriation, in a case of epistemic co-opting, we're going to say that the injustice lies in the clinician believing that they have equal subjective knowledge to those with the requisite lived experience. Davis introduces the concept of epistemic appropriation to capture not a conceptual deficit to epistemic resources, but instead a sort of conceptual theft. The theft for Davis involves a dominantly situated individual or group robbing a marginalized group of their cultivated epistemic resources. These epistemic resources are then appropriated for the gain of the dominant group without recognizing the original epistemic contributors. However, epistemic appropriation described by Davis doesn't seem to precisely fit the harm that Matthew and I recognized in empathic understanding. The clinician acknowledges that the source of understanding is actually stemming from the patient, so we can't say that there's any kind of epistemic detachment or epistemic misdirection, which seems to be a key part of epistemic appropriation. So for this reason, appropriation isn't the correct term to use here. Instead, we identify the harm as being some kind of conceptual co-opting rather than a theft. Therefore, I argue that if the clinician claims to have the same knowledge of the lived experience as the patient, they're co-opting the patient's epistemic privilege. The term epistemic privilege was popularized by standpoint feminist theory and originally pertained to the invaluable insight that a woman has into her experiences of womanhood. And given this insight, standpoint theorists argue that women should be responsible for defining their experiences in their own terms. And in this sense, the term privilege isn't some kind of beneficial social position that a group has and that's unduly been bestowed on them. Rather, it's a unique and vital perspective on a lived experience. The concept of epistemic privilege doesn't need to be so narrow, though. In her fantastic book, Black Feminist Thought, Patricia Hill Collins establishes Black women's standpoint on their experiences of family, friendship, communities, religion, and work. Collins emphasizes the value of such lived experience, not only as a means to expand Black feminist knowledge and to challenge power dynamics, but Collins hints that there is something inherently valuable about that knowledge itself, regardless of the secondary benefits. It's an essential aspect of the self, being an agent of knowledge through specific lived experiences. Indeed, self-definition is an essential aspect of epistemic privilege. In the words of Tracy Bowell, this assertion of identity, of who I am, adds to a body of knowledge about how my life is and how I experience the world. So asserting one's standpoint is to assert one's authentic identity and to transcend the stereotypes and prejudices manifested by more dominant groups. By overstating the clinician's ability to access the patient's lived experience, their standpoint, through the empathic approach, the clinician risks co-opting the epistemic privilege of the marginalized subject. And as such, we contribute the term epistemic co-opting to the literature on epistemic injustice. In doing so, the clinician co-opts something that essentially does not belong to them. They co-opt the lived experience integral to the identity and the self-definition of the patient and claim some knowledge of it. And they attempt to participate in a personal identity-informing process of self-assertion despite not being a member of the marginalized group and not having the requisite lived experiences. This elicits an epistemic harm as it dilutes the patient's claim over their lived experience, and their status as a self-defining knower is impugned. In addition, epistemic co-opting may include what Alessandra Tansini refers to as intellectual arrogance. Unlike in cases of haughtiness, intellectual arrogance doesn't necessarily involve a sense of superiority or disrespect for other epistemic agents. Tansini captures intellectual arrogance through the example of the scientist. She says, a scientist may be arrogant in the way in which he conducts his inquiry. He may, for instance, be unwilling to contemplate that he has made a mistake when an experiment produces results that are not credible. Tansini recognizes that intellectual arrogance may be motivated by a sense of unaccountability or an overestimation of one's abilities, and we think it's the latter that is happening here in epistemic co-opting, as the clinician assumes that the position of a knowledge that they can't possibly obtain. And as such, the clinician mistakenly inflates their own epistemic capacities. I'm going to bring things to a close now because I think I'm over time. But I want to say that following this exploration of empathic understanding and its contemporary forms, I argue that empathic understanding risks overstating one's ability to access the patient's experience. I think there's a danger of error due to the transformative experience, leading to misdiagnosis and mistreatment and an overall misunderstanding. And there's also a potential for epistemic injustice through co-opting the patient's experience and their and potentially intellectual arrogance. On these grounds, we argue that empathic understanding is an unhelpful concept in phenomenological psychopathology. Attempting to have a surrogate lived experience of a psychiatric condition only hinders understanding and risks undermining the epistemic agency of the patient. Rather than attempting to try to overcome the limits of empathic understanding, we're inclined to agree with Jaspers that it's impossible to reproduce a radically different lived experience in the clinician, and to extend this idea beyond schizophrenia to encompass other diagnoses. This isn't to say that it's impossible for the clinician to understand a given condition. Rather, it's that an alternative methodology is necessary. Radcliffe, Sass, and Stanglini emphasize the importance of recognizing the difference of the other's lived world experience. After acknowledging this, instead of attempting to try and reshape empathic understanding so that the clinician can still have some kind of quasi-direct perception of the patient's experiences, we think that we ought to just respect this difference and face the fact that it means that we can't perceive their experience, and that they do have that epistemic privilege. Okay, thank you very much. I can't wait for your questions.
Thank you, Lucienne, for this great presentation. I'll open the floor for discussion and questions from people both online and here at the Institute. So do we have any questions? You will not be able to see the speaker because of the camera problem, but you will hear her. So please.
Okay, can you hear me, Lucienne?
Yes, I can hear you. Hi.
Hi. Thank you for your stimulating lecture. I have to admit that I was really intrigued by the title of your lecture. So I somehow found, yesterday I found the text on Google, I mean, the ResearchGate. So I actually both listened to the lecture and read the text, and I'm very...
Thank you.
Yes. And I'm very interested in comment on giving you a few comments and asking a few questions. First of all, I would like to read all 4 questions, if that's not a problem, and then allow you to comment on things that resonate with you. Okay. So first of all, I would like to support the direction and the conclusion of your presentation and the worry about epistemic harms. But nonetheless, as a psychiatry survivor, and I identify as a psychiatry survivor who is opposed to involuntary psychiatry, I would like to comment that these worries are, when I read about them after the experience of institutionalized psychiatry, these worries seem to be outweighed by a more general question. I mean, we are talking about epistemic agency, about epistemic privilege, about this self-defining potential. But the question is any kind of agency with the self-defining potential in the proper sense of the word possible in the context of involuntary psychiatry? This is what was, I mean, I love the way you argued for virtuous listening, and I love the direction of your thought, but I said to myself, this would apply very well to consensual psychiatry. But in the context of involuntary psychiatry, I thought of this metaphor we usually use of focusing on the tree without seeing the forest. Mm-hmm. You understand what I mean? So this is my first question. And the second question is about the word tool. I guess Jaspers himself said that empathy was a tool. And I understand that it aims more at knowledge than at feelings. I mean, empathy is a sui generis word now. We can say what exactly it is. It's a philosophical question. But I want to say that when we talk about any kind of encounter, be it clinical or everyday encounter, it seems to me that there is this element of luck, or religious people would say grace. There is this extra personal element which contributes to there being a click between between two people, the doctor and the patient. And in this sense, we cannot say that one can exercise empathy as a tool to such a degree so that it guarantees the success, the success is partially, mediated by grace or chance or luck or something that we cannot control in the encounter between two people. And the third question is, this is really important for me because I have the experience of psychiatry, and it's about the something you mentioned, the objectifying the gaze on the patient. And correct me if I'm wrong. I can happily detect in your presentation an incipient moral preference for the linguistic over the objectifying observational gaze. Okay, so I can detect something like that. And but in my view, as a survivor, I think that the situation is not very much different from the asylums. Sorry, sorry to make it a little bit pathetic. I'm not trying to be pathetic. It's not different from the asylum situations that Foucault was talking about, in the sense that the scenery and the etiquette are different, but the observational gaze, I think, is still present. And it is more than obvious if we pay attention to the technical terms psychiatrists use in writing their reports, such as, number one, the patient is maintaining eye contact. I actually had a psychiatrist write down on a piece of paper that I maintained eye contact, and I was like, how can a person insult anyone by writing such a, such an objectifying statement? And then sometimes the psychiatrists are more interested in the tone of your speech, in the syntax of your speech, than in the semantics of your speech. And often, if you're a very perceptive patient, you can see the psychiatrist gazing at your body language or listening to the syntax of your speech, rather than paying attention to the meaning you're trying to convey. So my question would be, would you agree with me that the use of such technical terms, which are revelatory of the observational gaze, should be reduced or banned or somehow sanctioned in psychiatry? These are really long questions, so I think I should stop here. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for such interesting questions. Sorry, I didn't catch your name because I'd love to chat with you more or follow you online.
Okay, of course. By mistake, I turned off the microphone, but I'm online again. So my name is Bojana, and I have a degree in philosophy, but I'm also a psychiatry survivor, and I'm quite perplexed by these issues personally. They concern me on a level that people who have not experienced the psychiatric and institutional context cannot, let us not use the word empathy, but they tend to minimize the suffering that can sometimes be felt in these contexts.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing those experiences with me with such fantastic questions. In terms of your first question, whether or not some kind of epistemic agency is possible in involuntary psychiatry, I think that's so important. I was trying to get funding actually for a project on looking at the Mental Health Act and looking at involuntary psychiatry, because I don't think there's enough research out there in there at all. And I think you're right. My perspective has been of somebody in voluntary psychiatry, because that's my personal experiences. So I'm afraid I have had a bias there. I think the epistemic injustice in things like the Mental Health Act in involuntary psychiatry is a very interesting and important thing to look at. Particularly, I've been reading Foucault, and I think that there's a completely different epistemic domain at work in those situations. And as I've suggested in my work, I think that there needs to be some kind of joint operation where there are both, you've got the epistemic knowledge, the contributions from the clinician, but the patient is seen and respected as having equal epistemic agency. And as you said, I don't know whether or not that can occur in a case of involuntary psychiatry. Not only because of the power dynamics, but I guess if the person doesn't want that discussion, doesn't want that understanding to even take place in the first place, and that's a completely different situation. So I think that's really interesting and a really important thing for future work to look into, generally the epistemic injustice in involuntary psychiatry, but the role of empathy, not only empathic understanding, but this broader idea of empathy and care-based empathy in involuntary psychiatry, I think is really important. Second, looking at whether there's where you were talking about this click between the patient and the clinician. I thought that was a great phrase to use, this click. And my understanding is what you were saying is that if there isn't that click to begin with, you can't use empathy as a tool at all. I don't know if I've understood you right, but I thought that was really interesting. I've been thinking about that myself in terms of my interest in intersubjectivity, because what is that click? What is that click that we have not only in this psychiatric interactions, but in other interactions in life where you do experience that click between yourself and the other person? And it seems to me like it might be this Meta-Leben that Jaspers describes of us connecting on some kind of primordial level and understanding one another. And you said that there's an element of luck involved.
Yes.
I
Yes.
wonder if it's just like luck in terms of you happen to find somebody that you click with, but I think there must be a reason for the intersubjectivity to work as well as it does. Maybe there needs to be this receptive openness that Ratcliffe was talking about, or maybe it's something to do with like that virtuous listening that I describe in the paper, this phenomenological receptiveness to the other person. Or maybe it's like you have a clinician who has similar lived experiences to you. Like my preference is having maybe a female clinician to speak to, because if my gender happens to be a significant part of my experiences, etc. So I'm not sure if it's, I guess it's luck in respect of finding somebody that you that happens to fit those things. But I think we can manufacture that clicking in some way through maybe an openness through virtual.
Possible. I try so many times. I mean, I have, for example, I have the intuition. My gut feeling tells me I don't like this person. I don't like the psychiatrist, but then I say, no, she's smart, he's smart. No, I like him, blah, blah, blah. But in the end, I always end up changing the psychiatrist. So I think this, for me, the gut feeling always turns out to be the right, direction.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting thing to bring up. But yeah, I do think that click has to be associated with intersubjectivity. I think it has to be some kind of I-other connection going on there. But I completely understand. I think that is really interesting, and I think that kind of probably does need to be underlying beneath if empathic understanding were to take place. But as you've heard from my talk, I kind of feel like we need to throw that out anyway. So I think that
of course
that click, that intersubjective connection needs to be an essential part of the interaction between the clinician and the patient in any kind of successful psychiatric conversation, psychiatric treatment, discussion and diagnosis. In terms of the third comment, looking at the section on epistemic objectification, I didn't have time to cover that here, but sort of briefly for people who haven't read the paper, the idea of epistemic objectification is that one's epistemic agency can be undermined if a person is seen as a source of information from which information can be gleaned, rather than as an epistemic agent in themselves. This is something that Fricke talks about. She calls it epistemic objectification. And if you don't allow the patient to have that agency, then they're objectified in this epistemic sense. And I think the examples that you gave perfectly illustrate this, saying that the clinician writing down the patient is maintaining eye contact, focusing on your tone of speech, and this observation, again, like in Foucault. And I think the medical gaze is an important thing to talk about. And if I understood you properly, I think you were saying, because I focus on kind of like linguistic interactions being
yes,
positive thing.
Yes, I actually the ideal psychiatric, clinical encounter would be one that is deprived of in which the observational gaze doesn't belong to a specific category where the observation is just the ordinary observation that two people who meet have of each other. We all observe each other. But I personally dislike the psychiatric gaze, which is a professional observational gaze. And for this reason, I decided to heal through Christianity, where when I talk to a monk, I and the monk, we can talk about experiences we both had. So he doesn't have the observational gaze any more acute than my observational gaze on him. So for this reason, this was really perplexing and disturbing for me. And for this reason, I decided to find a totally different way of healing. Mm-hmm. The asymmetry is something that I really oppose, and one of the main opponents and of this asymmetry was Virginia Woolf, whom you might know as a researcher in feminism. And in her book, Mrs. Dalloway, she is describing the asymmetry and the observational gaze. And I happen to be influenced by that book. And for me personally, it's something that's really, really deeply disturbing.
Thank you. So I don't know if you've cut off or whether you've finished speaking.
I finished speaking.
Oh, good. Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. I agree with you that the medical gaze is a really important thing to think about. I think that it can indeed happen in speech expression, and maybe that's something that I ought to emphasize in my future work or any future talks about this as well. And I agree with you that there are power dynamics that are entrenched in the psychiatric encounter that make it very difficult to get rid of that medical gaze. So I kind of fully support other means of meaning making like that you described through Christian. As somebody who wants to try to, I suppose, adapt psychiatry, I guess my focus is on trying to adjust this gaze and have kind of like I focus on co-production and this joint operation between the clinician and the patient. But I completely understand why it would be better to go into a completely different direction and be like, the power dynamics are much better here, and I've got somebody who I think would be better at the meaning making process. So yeah, I really appreciate it. Thank you for your questions.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you both. Do we have any more questions from people here or online? You can also write your questions online. Nothing?
I've got a question.
Hi.
Yeah, hopefully everyone can hear me okay. Yeah, yeah, my name is Vuk. I'm a psychiatrist and took part in this cycle of lectures. I wanted to ask, well, first of all, actually, I wanted to thank you for the criticism of Radcliffe and Stengelini, because it does sound like they're trying to kind of sneak in a certain narcissism and a kind of hermeneutic narcissism, like, no, it's such radical openness, and then they slap on this sort of intellectual like idea on the other's experience. Now, my question is, you said we cannot perceive their experience, obviously, lived experience. Can we perceive something partially through this embodied intersubjectivity? Is my question. Well, is one question. I have a few more. The other is, since I'm a psychodrama therapist in training, and like, which is interesting because you mentioned like that Jaspers said there's a tentative exchange of roles and dramatic play, which sort of, activates my psychodrama alarm. My question is like, if is there still something to gain if I take the role of my patient, if I try to step into the role of my patient, like not cognitively, but in a psychodrama way, I take up his posture or her posture or their posture, try to feel what they're feeling, sort of go into the role. If I gain something from this, and also trying to gain some information from intersubjectivity, and then try to give it back to the patient in a non-dominating way, not being like epistemically abusive, like do you think there's something to be gained there? And my third question is, riffs on that. Do you think like we could increase openness to altered experiences by having clinicians go through altered experiences that are similar to certain experiences, psychiatric experiences, like for instance taking high doses of psychedelics to have a psychotic like experience, or like spending a week on an inpatient unit, like being a patient and spending spending time with the patients. I mean, obviously they would know that you're not, or maybe they wouldn't. Like you can spend time in somewhere where people don't know you, and then having that sort of experience of people at least partially, playing the roles of yes, of the psychiatric institutionality. I don't know. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for such interesting questions. I have been thinking long and hard about whether I want to say that there's sort of a partial level of, I wouldn't say perception, because I feel like perception is too much. I feel like a partial level of understanding. In the same way that there was this really good show that was on when I was younger, and I can't remember what it was called, but the premise of it was that famous people had to experience what it was like to be homeless, which I thought was really interesting. I guess maybe that's more in line with your second question. But I was thinking that to some extent, if I really think about it, I can think about, okay, I've had experiences where I'm incredibly cold. I've had experiences where I'm scared or lonely. I've had experiences where I'm vulnerable, and I can try to draw upon those. And maybe the patient is a woman. I'm a woman as well. I know what it feels to be a vulnerable woman. And I feel like maybe I mean, also not just from listening, from a virtuous listening to their experiences. I think that maybe I can have a partial understanding, as you put it, of their experiences, which I wouldn't want to call a perception. But at the end of the day, I can't claim the epistemic privilege that they have of actually experiencing homelessness. I can't possibly comprehend the extent of what that would actually feel like, all of those things combined day after day. So I think that maybe there is some kind of partial insight and understanding that we can gain, particularly from what I refer to as virtuous listening, particularly from respecting the other person's epistemic privilege and listening to their experiences. I think there can be some level of understanding. It's just not on the same level of their own insight. I think it's so interesting that you're a psychodrama therapist. I'm a big drama and theatre nerd, so that's something that I'm really interested in, and I think is a really important technique. And when you're talking about experiencing the role of the other, and you said, is there something to gain in this attempt to understand? And as I suggested in the first thing, I think there's definitely something to gain. I think we definitely should try to understand still the experience of the other, especially the experience of the marginalized other. But it's about having the epistemic humility to know that you don't, that you might get it wrong, that they definitely know better, that you only have a partial understanding. So yeah, I think definitely attempt to understand whilst retaining epistemic humility, that they're the ones who know. And then I thought the final point was really interesting. Should psychiatrists be subjected to psychedelics, to spending time in patient units? The latter, I think, would definitely be really interesting. Again, talking about that TV program where it was like news readers had to experience what it was like to be homeless. The cameras left them, they were left alone, they had to beg for food on the street. That I think that having those kind of experiences could be really insightful, but I don't know how we would implement this, so how we would get psychiatrists to stay on a mental health ward, kind of like undercover boss situation. But I do think that'd be really interesting, and I do think that the best psychiatrists that I have experienced, no, I don't want to say the best psychiatrists, the people who have both the experiential knowledge and the clinical knowledge, who have been psychiatrists for me, I think have this kind of whole package going on, which I think is really useful. So I do think it's an extremely useful tool to have experiential knowledge as well. So yeah, I think that'd be really interesting. Thank you for those questions.
Okay, thank you both again for the lovely discussion. Do we have any more questions? Do you have any follow-up questions or comments?
No, well, the thing that yeah, obviously implementation would be horrible. Yeah, but the thing that also well came to mind when you said like epistemic humility, in psychodrama, when you do this technique, when you try, it's called doubling. When you try to double, to be like a double of the patient, and then you try to vocalize what you're feeling to see if it sort of has any relevance. Like you always kind of bracket it with, just repeat what's yours, what's your experience, just sort of to protect yourself from it being like just a sort of a dominant interpretation, it was your mother's subconscious or whatever. No, it's like, I'm feeling this in your role, does this have anything to do with you? And just sort of to stop it being like a projection or anything. So yeah, that's yeah, yeah, that's what came to mind. Yeah, like sort of trying not for it not to be like, no, this is truth. No, it's not. Obviously not. Yeah, it's my experience trying to sort of extract some parts of understanding of another one's lived experience through intersubjectivity.
Yeah, I think that's a really important exercise, and I think it also made me think that rather than just communicating through pathographies and narratives, I think art, like theatre, is a fantastic way of trying to communicate those experiences. I think often because these experiences go beyond words, sometimes art, visual representations, film, a piece of theatre can really hit at the heart at depicting an experience better sometimes than a pathography can. So that's another reason why I think drama is a really important tool that we can use in psychiatry. So yeah, thank you very much.
Okay. Any more?
Maybe Janko, before we close things off, maybe I can pop into the chat the Renewing Phenomenological Psychopathology mailing list in case people are interested in getting involved in that. We have at the moment a co-production scheme running. As you probably got from the talk, that I think co-production is incredibly important in the way forward, and we're sort of matching up researchers with people with lived experience, or some people of course might be in both categories. They might be research with lived experience, but yeah, joining up researchers and people with lived experience to co-produce work in these areas so that we've got the experiential knowledge on our side. So if that's something you might be interested, please do get in touch. And we also have a special issue at the moment, which is going to be in the journal Philosophical Psychology on the theme of renewing phenomenological psychopathology. So you might want to contribute to that as well. Just trying to find the link. Sorry, I should have had this to hand. Yeah, ask me any other questions, but while I try and find the link to this.
So I'll pop in with a comment or some sort of a question. I agree with, I was kind of persuaded by your criticism of this kind of empathic understanding and how important or on the importance of it in the whole encounter between the patient and the clinician. But what would be, you talked about some of the ways to remedy this situation. What would be the best way perhaps to advance a different approach? For example, in one of the earlier talks in our seminar, Roy Dings talked about this whole idea of experiential knowledge and having expertise by experience, which would be a very useful sort of a tool to have this kind of a practitioner or a clinician that has some kind of experience or someone that is an expert by experience beside a clinician that would work with him, that would work with patients and so on. And Roy talked about in theoretical terms about this kind of a tuning of our responsivity to our affordances. So he talks about the whole framework of affordances, using that kind of a framework to understand even empathic understanding and how to empathize with the patient, how to understand him in different ways. So he wants to understand it by using a tuning of responsivity. And this is achieved in this kind of shared experience. In a way, he wants to stress that we have more shared experiences than we usually assume when we talk to a patient and when we try to understand a totally different, radically different experience, such as someone with delusional experiences or someone who's an autistic person, for example. We usually assume upfront that that kind of experience is totally different from anything that we have in our background, but through this kind of a tuning, we can see that there are similar experiences that, of course, are not matching to the one that the patient or the person with the condition has, but something that can indirectly link us to the experience. So that one way of theoretically coming to this is this kind of a tuning, synchronizing between the patient and the clinician through the some kind of a shared experience that they can achieve. So that's more of a comment. Do you think that is the way to go for remedying the problems with the empathic understanding in the clinician-patient encounter, or there are some other ways that would be better? So let's jump.
Thank you very much for that. I did really enjoy Roy Ding's talk, and I've spoke to him by email about he's got similar questions to yourself about this. And I think he puts forward a really interesting argument, but for me, even though, as I've kind of said, we can relate on some partial level, I think that there are some essential experiences that are transformative experiences that you can't have access to. You know, I've got endometriosis, and a few days ago I went to see my male doctor about it, and he is an expert in endometriosis. It's kind of like Mary in the black and white room, right? He knows everything there is to know about endometriosis biologically, things that I can't possibly understand or I can't be bothered to try and understand. But he will never know the experience of the specific pain. He's experienced pain before, but he doesn't know this particular pain. He doesn't know how it feels to be a woman with these particular things, etc. And I just think fundamentally he doesn't have that experiential knowledge, and that's okay. There seems to be this real pressure, I feel like, in psychiatry to have this precision to be like, no, I'm having this direct experience. And I wonder if it comes from, it feels like in the birth of psychiatry, it kind of trying to put itself on the same level as medical and as somatic medicine, and therefore trying to say things like, yes, we can find ways of getting this direct experience, and I think you just can't, and that's okay. And it just means that the patient does have that a knowledge that you don't have. And I think that in terms of your question about what should we sort of replace empathic understanding with, Matthew and I conclude the paper by looking at, like I said, Fricker's idea of virtuous listening, but I try and sort of imbue it with phenomenology. I'm really interested in Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology of speech expression. Merleau-Ponty's my main guy. I love his work. And through this Merleau-Ponty's idea of speech expression, when he talks about hearing the authentic speech of the other and enriching your own thoughts and your own understanding and and it's not about like I can directly perceive the thoughts of the other person. I don't think you can directly perceive that experience, but I think that your ideas can be enriched by this kind of virtuous listening, and in that and creating an environment where the clinician and the patient combine their expertise in order to draw out relevant meaning structures, I think is really important. In terms of this, like the co-production at work here, this joint activity, which can both help the self-understanding of the patient if they're helped in terms of articulating their experiences. And as I said, it doesn't have to just be linguistically. If there were artistic ways of them articulating their experiences, that would be fantastic as well. So that'd be great for self-understanding and understanding of the clinician of what's going on as well. Yeah, I just don't think it needs to be that you're literally perceiving that lived experience. I don't think that's necessary. But I'm very much open to other ideas of empathy that aren't this empathic understanding put forward by Jaspers. You know, general ideas of care, maybe even sympathy, like the way that Jaspers describes sympathy does seem to be really important as well. And it's kind of put aside as being like, oh, sympathy is just the whatever. But sympathy seems pretty important to me and seems to maybe be an important underlying things in terms of this intersubjective experience as well. So yeah, I'm saying both virtuous listening, a phenomenological idea of virtuous listening, and maybe bring back sympathy as being a really helpful tool that isn't trying to do too much, doesn't claim to be able to do too much, you know.
Thanks, that's an excellent response. But what if we have like a patient that is nonverbal, who cannot speak for himself, herself about her own experiences, or even radical cases like autistic children who are nonverbal? What in that case? So there will always be this kind of a chasm or way of understanding the other's experience. So, I will not take any more time. If you have anything to add, or
for me, no. It's interesting what you said about nonverbal experience, because I've written a paper on dementia and nonverbal expression and epistemic injustices revolving around that. I think it's really important when people aren't able to express themselves verbally, like some people with late stage dementia, some people with autism. I think that they're very much in danger of being disregarded and seen as there's not a possible for us to understand them. Whereas communicative gestures are really important to look out for in terms of understanding. And I think there can be a real silencing and ignoring of those gestures and them being dismissed as just behavioral movements. And I think it's really important to take those seriously just as much as we should take speech expression seriously.
Okay, there is another question from Ellie or Eli. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. It's in the chat. Can you see it? Or I'll read. So it's not really a question, it's more of a thought. It seems to me that all psychotherapy includes a level of disbelief, if you like, of the patient's assertion, in the sense that there is an assumption that the client cannot see part of themselves or herself. And these are the parts that can be highlighted by the therapist and can be worked on by the patient and the therapist. Maybe I'm wrong about this, but if this is indeed right, how does this fit in with your view?
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Ellie. I think that you are right. You know, there's like Gadamer talks about the hermeneutic problem in psychiatry, and there's a bridge that you're trying to cross there. in terms of these really unique experiences that you're trying to get your head around, you're trying to understand, and it's a very unique situation. And I think that, yeah, you said that all psychotherapy includes a level of disbelief of the patient's assertion. I mean, that might not be what you meant, or maybe rather than disbelief. Sorry, you can put in the chat if your microphone's not working, maybe if there was an alternative word to disbelief, because the rest of what you're saying seems to be more about a difficulty to understand rather than like a disbelief, if I'm right in thinking. Yeah, something more like that. Yeah, I think that there's a hermeneutic problem definitely in psychiatry, and we have to try to find ways of overcoming it, and it's one of the most difficult things to overcome. So I think there's definitely always that obstacle there. And I thought it was really interesting with, I wrote their name down and now I've lost it. Oh, Rihanna's comment about finding means of Christianity and talking to a monk in order to try and overcome that hermeneutic problem, I think is really interesting. I think we do need to look at these alternative methods, like psychodrama as well. It's a means of trying to overcome these hermeneutic problems, and sometimes maybe other alternative methods are out there instead of psychiatry. You know, yeah. But thank you very much for that, Ellie.
Well, thank you for your question and for the answer. If nobody has any more questions. Okay, we can end the discussion here. So Lucienne, thank you again. This was a wonderful talk. I was very interested in this topic. Thank you for agreeing to do this lecture at our seminar. Hopefully we will see you again here and be part of this, or some of your colleagues from the renewing phenomenological psychopathology project. So thank you everyone for tuning in today and for great questions and great discussion. And I hope that I will see you again.
Yes, thank you everybody. Thanks for enriching my thoughts on this topic, and I can't wait to attend the future lectures.
Yes. Also, I hope that the questions have been helpful for you and the paper and your future work. Yes.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.